We're on air. That's it. We're on air. Thank you very much for coming. Could each witness please state your full name, position, title, and swear either an oath or an affirmation? Perhaps starting with you, Mr. Grant.
My name is Andrew Rutherford Grant. I'm a private citizen and former senior curator at the Powerhouse Museum. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you. Mr. Debenham.
Ian Debenham is my name. I'm a private citizen and a former Curator of Transport at the Powerhouse Museum. And I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And Mr. Simpson?
Yes, my name is Andrew John Simpson. I'm a private citizen. I'm a former museum curator and museum practitioner in a number of different institutions. And I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Would any or all of you like to start by making a short 2-minute statement? Perhaps starting with you, Mr. Grant?
I would like to thank you, Chair. I can't promise to keep it to 2 minutes, but I'll do my best.
Oh, well, nobody else has this morning. So.
Exactly. Fine. It'll be a first.
It'll be a first if you can.
Okay, thank you.
Feel free to be open and...
Thank you, Chair.
Don't be restricted.
Firstly, my thanks to the members of the committee for once again inviting me to give evidence to this vital inquiry. This introductory statement relates to the terms of reference 1A1, the core visions behind the move, and 1A5, the impact on the heritage status of the site at Ultimo. It expresses my views about the disparity between the spirit of the government's commitment on the 4th of July to retain the Powerhouse Museum at Ultimo and the contrary evidence since that date. The public sentiment following the government's decision to retain the Powerhouse Museum at Ultimo confirmed a core assumption that any reasonable person would make, that the remaining permanent exhibitions and the character and traditions of the museum would be retained. However, since the announcement on 4 July, there has been little to suggest that this promise was made in good faith. I cite the following evidence that the attitude of the government, the museum's trust and senior management to the commitment to maintain the museum at Ultimo is disingenuous. Firstly, the Harwood building, about which I understand the committee has heard something already this morning. The Harwood building, formerly Stage 1 Powerhouse Museum, is integral to the Powerhouse Museum historically and functionally. It incorporates the first electric tram depot in Sydney, built in 1899, the first structure of what was to become by the 1920s the largest tramway network in the British Commonwealth outside London, a signifier of Sydney's coming of age as a city. The title of the tram depot site was transferred to the museum in 1964, following the end of the initial electric tram era in Sydney. The retention of the Harwood building, the former tram depot, in all its current functions is essential if the museum is to be retained at Ultimo in recognisable form. These functions include a fully equipped workshop, large object handling and treatment, exhibition preparation, staging and presentation area, temporary exhibition movements, photography studio, conservation laboratories, publicly accessible research library and archives, building maintenance workshops, and collection management and other staff accommodation, and of course, high-quality storage that is, for the record, publicly accessible. Yet, in his evidence given at the inquiry hearing on the 29th of July, the Arts Minister revealed a grossly inadequate understanding of the Harwood building's function as merely storage. He stated that if the Castle Hill site can meet the museum's storage needs, there will be no need for the Harwood building. This would be astoundingly wasteful and short-sighted, yet there are plans to demolish the Harwood building in favour of a lyric theatre and rehearsal spaces. The claimed operational problems of the Harwood building are baseless and designed to discredit what is a unique and envied museum facility in Australia and very rare internationally. Put simply, the Harwood building was designed and built to function as the mothership of operations at Ultimo. Secondly, a few months ago, Goulburn Mulwaree Council requested the long-term loan of the museum's 1837 Maudsley beam engine because of its early history at Goulburn Brewery. The Maudsley engine is second only in significance to the Bolton and Watt beam engine and is a key steam-powered exhibit in the museum's Steam Revolution exhibition. It is critical to the narrative of that exhibition. Even considering the loan of an object in a long-term exhibition is highly irregular. In terms of assessing the intention to retain the remaining permanent exhibitions at Ultimo, it's a canary in the coal mine, if you like. If it were to be removed, nothing else would be safe. Yet the museum's CEO advised at the first hearing of this inquiry that the loan was still being considered. If the museum's intentions were to retain that exhibition, the request would have been politely but swiftly declined. Thirdly, the Icons exhibition, opened in 2016 near the museum's entrance, featured some of the finest examples of the museum's rich collection, such as the 1929 Grand Prix Bugatti, the original black box flight recorder, and a 15th century bronze temple bell. This exhibition was quietly removed on the 31st of July 2020. This is appalling timing and a breach of good faith with the public just after public interest had been elevated by the decision to retain the museum at Ultimo. Guided tours of the museum to see the remaining exhibitions and savour the wonderful building spaces have since been at capacity. Lastly, the Minister and the museum's CEO announced at this inquiry on the 29th of July that 3 very large objects would be retained at Ultimo, namely the Bolton and Watt engine, locomotive number 1 and the Catalina flying boat. The Minister cited their exemplary status as signifiers of, quote, periods of extraordinary innovation and creativity, unquote. Whatever truth lies in that assertion, it's absurd to isolate these 3 large objects as a group, highly significant as they are, as if they possess a special capacity to illustrate this theme, which applies almost universally to the collection as a whole. Of course, there are far more plausible explanations of a political, engineering and financial nature that would have driven the government's decision to retain them at Ultimo, while the public and media outcry rose and damning expert opinion rained down. So the government has transparently attempted to make a virtue out of a necessity. The real concern here is that the list of objects to be retained at Ultimo is so short, or that there is a list at all. The implication is that nothing else will be retained at Ultimo. What a cruel hoax that would be on an unsuspecting public. And finally, a word about co-location. Professor Glover has often used the axiom, 1 museum, 4 sites. But these 4 sites are not all museums. Castle Hill is and will remain a display storage facility. Plans to centralise the collection and various museum services there, such as the Research Library, and the creation of a new museum site at Parramatta, will make its relatively distant location of even more strategic importance to the other sites in terms of operational costs and inefficiencies, such as the movements of staff between Ultimo, Parramatta and Castle Hill. The co-location of the Harwood building and the museum's public spaces has been of inestimable importance to the functioning of the museum since 1988, completely overlooked by the government or simply not understood to date. Object movements require individual risk management, which is greatly simplified by close location. In recent years, there have been 40 to 50,000 object movements annually between the Harwood building and other museum sites. The distance between Ultimo, Castle Hill and Parramatta will pose enormous operational inefficiencies and unnecessary risks, especially for object movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Debenham?
Well, some of my points are going to be pretty similar to some of Andrew's points. My points are just that, points, and so my statement will be considerably shorter. But anyway, thank you, committee members, for inviting me to give evidence to this inquiry. My introductory statements respond to items 1A, 1, 2 and 4 of the terms of reference and speak to the core vision, governance of the project and the issue of site flooding at Parramatta. It is my impression that the initial statement made to transfer the Powerhouse Museum to Parramatta in its entirety was made without the benefit of due diligence or understanding of the magnitude and complexity of the task. The statement was publicised without the benefit of any due diligence. This has subsequently blighted the continuing operation of the Powerhouse Museum, the development of the proposed Parramatta Museum, wasted 5 years of planning, public servants' time and public money on consultants who have either no museum experience or experience in museums with the complexity and breadth of the collections of the Powerhouse Museum. The New South Wales Government continues to show a total lack of understanding of the requirements of a working museum. This is demonstrated by the ongoing consideration to demolish or repurpose the Harwood Building, an essential building for the continued operation of the museum at Ultimo. The centering of some museum functions and personnel at Castle Hill makes a mockery of the years that the government has decreased the museum's budgets by the so-called efficiency dividend. The proposed Parramatta Museum site planning does not appear to take account of expected sea level rises in the future. Adapt New South Wales has published a likely scenario that by 2100 the sea level on the New South Wales coast will rise by a minimum range of 0.24 to 0.61 metres to a maximum range of 0.54 to 1.06 metres, depending on atmospheric emissions. The proposed Parramatta Museum planning does not seem to have embraced the council and community of Parramatta's desires for their world-class institution, viz. Recognition of the richness of Aboriginal cultural heritage at the heart of the city's identity and the significant European heritage which is one of the most significant in the nation. And that wording is taken from the City of Parramatta Executive Summary submission in response to SSDA. The possible limiting of the aviation exhibition at Ultimo to the Catalina greatly reduces the benefit to the visiting public of the museum's aviation collection. The displayed full-size aircraft in their diversity tell a variety of stories of achievement, design, technology, history and Australia's significant place on the world stage.
Thank you, Mr Debenham. Mr Simpson?
Thank you, Chair. Look, as I concur with many of the points that have already been made by the other two witnesses, I will be brief and just express a few general points that I'd like to. And I'd like to open by saying that I really are hopeful that this committee's work will help to shape a better future for museums in New South Wales, and that's a future where there is an articulated state plan for museum provision in the state, and where every museum in the state, from small volunteer-run outfits in the regions through to the large city-based museums, all feel connected to that plan and motivated by that plan. And I'm also hope that in the future that the research and analysis that underpins that plan doesn't start and finish with specifically prescribed political outcomes desired by the government of the day. Also hope that in the future museum collections themselves will be considered as cultural infrastructure and not just the buildings where they're kept.
Yeah.
And I also hope that museums don't continue to be one of the lesser priorities of Create New South Wales in terms of funding support. And I hope that in the future arbitrary closures and relocation proposals are nothing more than historic curiosities. And also that the people of Parramatta get the support for the museum they want. After all, they have been asking since 1899. And I hope that in the future we don't build new museums or even art centres for that matter on flood-prone sites. And I also hope that in the future the efficiency dividends and other forms of arbitrary financial constriction don't completely choke the creativity in the sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Yes, Mr. Debenham?
Debenham, yep.
Debenham. I understand that you have a connection to the Powerhouse Museum.
Yes, I do.
Can you elaborate on that and what makes you? I understand it was quite a senior position there.
Well,
You were a curator, is that right?
I was a curator, yes.
Okay.
Curator of Transport. Andrew and I were both curators of transport. Andrew
He's got
focused
3
more
years
on
on you, doesn't he? Does Andrew have 3 years on you at the museum? 33 years and
33 years and 30 years, yes. yes.
So you're a puppy.
I came in just before Andrew and I left just before Andrew.
Right.
Andrew, Curator of Transport, basically land transport.
Yep.
I focused on aviation with a minor component of maritime history as well, considering after I started, the National Maritime Museum started up, so that aspect of it sort of fell into the background and I focused on aviation, which was my strength anyway, having been a licensed aircraft maintenance engineer before I came to the museum.
Mr. Grant?
Yes.
So what is your experience in your activity involving maths?
I started at the museum in 1980. I was, from that year, Curator of Transport and Engineering. In 1988, I was appointed Senior Curator of Transport, and I held that position, apart from acting in a more senior management position, in the interim between 1988 and 2012, when I retired.
Now, I guess all three gentlemen, do you still have links to staff and activity that occurs at the Ultimo site?
Yes, we do. Ian and I have maintained our affiliation with the museum by doing some voluntary work, and so we have regular contact with some former colleagues and other volunteers, parts of the collection, but mainly through research work that we do. So it tends to be contact with existing data and information about the collection.
Okay, I want to take you to the July 4th announcement.
Yes.
So, are you familiar with the announcement?
Yes, I am. Not verbatim, but with its apparent intent.
Yeah, I guess that's where I was going to take you to, the spirit or the intent of the announcement. Do you feel that the July 4th announcement is, as the Premier, the Treasurer, and the Restored Arts Minister claimed, that it was the saving of the Ultimo site?
That's as I understand the media presented it and understood it, and how the public understood it. And indeed, I'd like to think that it was what the government had intended. But I cite the wording of a letter that a constituent of the Premier's received only a week ago.
Could you assist and read that into Hansard, please?
Very happy to, particularly the first sentence of the second paragraph, which says, "The decision to maintain the museum in the historic Powerhouse building at the Ultimo site, while also building the new flagship Parramatta Powerhouse, delivers many benefits to the people of New South Wales, and the New South Wales Government is pleased it has been so well received by the community."
Mr. Grant,
That's
would
the
you
second
mind,
paragraph.
so as we get the full context, would you mind tabling the correspondence?
Not in the least.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just making sure there's not a privacy issue in terms of if you needed to delete the name and address.
Yes, perhaps
Well,
that would be. Well, it's not a concern. It's not a concern of
I'm
mine.
just raising
but-
in case it is.
well,
Yeah, thank you,
we
thank you.
don't automatically publish it. We'll receive it and then we'll assess whether any more
Sure.
form we publish it.
I'd like to add a comment of my
Please,
own to that.
I'm sorry. I thought it stood there as it is, but please
I
elaborate.
believe it does stand as it is, but in the light of the Heritage Council's decision recently made public, that effectively the shell of the former Powerhouse building would be listed on the State Heritage Register, is very relevant, it seems, to the wording the historic Powerhouse building, as opposed to the wording in the Premier's letter, referring to the historic Powerhouse building, because it seems now that a more accurate interpretation of the government's announcement alludes to the preservation of the bricks and mortar of the former Powerhouse building, carefully and cautiously worded to avoid reference to the assembly of buildings that constitutes the Powerhouse Museum proper, which includes the Harwood building and the Rand building facing Harris Street, which are part of the award-winning complex that is known as the Powerhouse Museum. And if I could further draw on Dr. Simpson's point about the value in which collections are held and their place in regard to location and buildings, it's important that the committee is aware that many of my colleagues and myself and others I'm not aware of made submissions to the Heritage Council adamantly advocating for the listing on the State Heritage Register of the in situ exhibitions as well as the entire Powerhouse Museum complex as it's understood to be as being inseparable and having their own integrity, which makes the point that collections themselves, as Dr. Simpson was saying, collections themselves need to be recognised for their own heritage significance and sense of place.
Mr. Grant, would you characterise that letter from the Premier's office as being written highly, finely tuned legal letter?
I'm not expert in any way to comment on legal wording.
But you felt compelled to share it with us.
Indeed, at a layman level.
Yes.
Reflecting on the decision on the 4th of July and looking at the wording of this letter, I've concluded that it was carefully worded to avoid any reference to the Powerhouse Museum as a whole.
Thank you, Mr. Grant.
Well, could I ask you as well, on terms of the heritage, the application for heritage listing, we had evidence from Ms. Patricia Johnson earlier, and she said her view about the way in which the heritage listing was being progressed was that it also expressly or seemingly deliberately avoided reference to the word museum. So it was simply about some buildings isolated from their institutional context.
Yes, yes. And bizarrely, to take your point, Mr. Shoebridge, bizarrely referred to the Ultimo Powerhouse as being located at 500 Harris Street, Ultimo, which has only been a current address since the opening of the Powerhouse in 1988 on that site.
Yeah. Could I... a lot of the discussion in this committee is about very physical things, you know, bricks and mortar and the like. But particularly the two of you who have been curators at that facility for such a long time, and could I ask you about how important it is to have co-location of the Harwood building and the exhibition spaces, and how that works as a sort of coherent entity?
Certainly. I might ask my colleague Ian to answer that initially. I've said too much.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Okay. Well,
Dr. Simpson, if you have something to add, please feel free.
That's fine. Yep. At the simplest level of operation, the objects that are on open display, especially the large transport objects, the horse-drawn bus, automobiles, locomotive, carriage and things like that. Number one locomotive, for example, and its 3 carriages, they all require a weekly level of maintenance, and Andrew and I, every Tuesday morning before opening, would go in and we would clean down those objects, you know, give them a good dust, because human beings tend to create dust with, you know, skin flakes and fluff from clothes and things like that. So that was a weekly thing. So it's necessary to have staff close by. Now, might say, well, why not use cleaners for that? Cleaners are okay to clean down the display cases, but when it comes to handling things like automobiles and other objects, although they're generally robust, but it's very easy to damage paint surfaces if you're using the wrong material to clean down that object. It takes a level of knowledge and expertise. It's not a sort of a non-museum person's role to do that. There are also things like in the exhibition areas, light globes blow and things like that. You need electricians on hand. We had electricians on hand to be able to replace those light globes. If there are problems of the multimedia presentations that go along with exhibitions, then it's good to have the staff available when they occasionally break down. It's also the operations of photography and things like that. It's also good. And just another aspect of it is that curatorial proximity to the museum can be useful in that public service role when you occasionally get visitors into the museum who want to talk to a curator about a particular thing. They might have something that they want to offer to the museum, or they want to get some information about an object that they have brought in. So it's very handy to have curators who are au fait with the range of material to go and have a look at that, talk to the person, and that basically is good public relations for the museum itself. And at the early stage of the development of the Powerhouse project, Andrew and I and the other curators, registration staff included, were stationed at the Winds building in Regent Street in Redfern. And we always had to go into the museum just for that purpose of sometimes meeting members of the public who had come into the old building and asked for curatorial advice. Well, Andrew holds a record. He could get from the Winds building in Regent Street, Redfern, to the old building in Harris Street in 17 minutes. And that was all on Shank's pony. It would have taken longer to catch a bus or to catch the train from Redfern to Central and then get to the museum.
Just for the
we
record,
walked.
Shank's pony is walking. Yep.
So there are quite a few functions that are necessary. If any of the objects on open display are damaged, for example, then it's good for a registration person and the curator concerned to go and look at that damage, record the damage, get photography to photograph it and things like that.
Mr. Debenham, I understand that on sort of the daily running, there's a large number of convenience and proximity factors for the daily running of a museum. Dr. Simpson, I saw you indicating you may want to
just add to the point that's been made that it's essential in any decent planning for a museum to function correctly to have staff and facilities co-located with collections and exhibition spaces. Otherwise you're just going to rack up incredible costs in terms of staff time moving around from one place to another. And the work that staff like curators undertake in a museum is complex because it involves everything from research, conservation, overseeing conservation work, and engaging with the public. So if you've got all those activities co-located in the one area, they're obviously going to be much more efficient and much less costly than they otherwise would be if you separate one part of the ecosystem from the other.
Mr. Grant, what about when you're pulling together an exhibition and you need somewhere, I assume, to pull out the objects and have a look and see how they'll fit together, and then physically take them from wherever they're held in a storage facility and put them onto display? I assume the greater the distance you have between your storage and your display, a whole series of additional complex issues may arise in terms of transport, and it may limit your capacity.
Absolutely. There's a complex interaction of disciplines that takes place in the development of a museum exhibition, for argument's sake, or even in a decision that needs to be taken about the treatment of an object. One of the things I didn't say in my statement, but which is greatly to the merit of the Harwood building, is that it has a very substantial capacity to handle the enormous variety of artefacts in the collections of different materials, sometimes mixed media, as it's referred to. In other words, many different types of materials in the same object. And also to employ in appropriately facilitated laboratories and workshops the kind of people whose skills can be applied to making decisions about and acting on the decisions of treating and handling and displaying and interpreting those objects. That's the process that underpins the allusion you made, Mr. Shoebridge, to the importance of, in this case, a central location that is proximate to the museum, whatever museum it might be, the museum exhibition spaces, the public spaces of a museum, if you like. There are many, many examples of the practical dividend that the Harwood building has offered in the past and could continue to offer if it was allowed to continue to exist with the Powerhouse Museum in its current functions, and indeed expanded functions, if the decision was made to do so, and if those making the decision were more enlightened about the key relationships between the functions of the Harwood building, the people employed to care for the collection, and the diversity of the collection in close relationship.
Just on a very sort of practical level, I assume that there'd be some very fragile objects that you could have a risk assessment that says, well, maybe 1, 2 or 3 people might be able to carefully transport them from, say, the Harwood building into the Powerhouse exhibition space, and you would work out a safe method for transporting a fragile object. But if you have to then transport them from Castle Hill to Parramatta or Castle Hill to Ultimo, that risk profile may fundamentally change, and it may mean the item can never be put on public exhibition. Am I reading that?
Yes.
Is that too simplistic a view of it, or?
That's correct. Value judgments need to be made and relative decisions need to be taken in terms of risk management. We're all familiar with the concept of risk management in whatever field in which we operate. With regard to the museum, risk management clearly will function immediately under, of course, the primary concern for the safety of staff. The care of the collection becomes paramount. The nature of movement of objects, the number of steps involved in doing that, for example, from careful hands to a vehicle, and then from a vehicle to careful hands to an exhibition location, adds a level of complexity and risk that merely placing an object on a soft-tired trolley and taking it directly 100, 200 metres to a place of exhibition is much more straightforward and greatly simplifies and reduces the amount of risk involved. It can't be avoided, these situations can't be avoided, but steps can be taken to minimise the proportion of times in which risk is considered unacceptable. The retention, for example, of the highly sophisticated storage facility in the basement of the Harwood building would go a long way to minimising the local risks associated with object movements in Ultimo itself.
Did you want to go?
Oh, you finish, David, and then I just have a few questions.
We had Mr. Sharp earlier say that give an estimate of the cost of moving what's in the Harwood building now, and if I remember correctly, his estimate was somewhere in the order of $200 million. If you can comment on that, by all means do, but on the cost. But I can ask you about what the practicalities are, how you would go about moving so many objects from the current facility to a new storage facility in Castle Hill. What does that mean in practice?
Happy to take this initially. You may wish to add, Ian. Essentially, it's a highly complex inventory exercise, whilst also being an opportunity that the museum has, to its credit, taken to digitise what it can of the collection whilst that opportunity presents itself. There is some debate as to what digitising the collection actually means, because you need to define what use you want to make of digital images that are available online to enable a researcher, for example, who's a specialist researcher in one field relating to the some type of collection in the museum. A researcher may wish to know much more in detail than somebody who's undertaking a school project may wish to know. So how much information is captured in digitising will greatly increase or decrease the actual cost of the process that you're alluding to. But essentially, objects, it is a museum practice that objects are inspected by conservators before they're moved from A to B for any purpose, whether they're going on loan or whether they're going from one museum site to another or whether they're going on exhibition. And that's a sound practice that has its obvious benefit in terms of maintaining and minimising information, maintaining close information about and well-documented information about the condition of objects in the collection and how and when damage may have occurred, if indeed it does. So that process, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of objects, I'm not in a position to put a cost figure on. Dr. Sharp may have done so, but it's a complex, time-consuming exercise, and it requires training and expertise on behalf of those who undertake that process.
Mr. Debenham?
It may be necessary in some cases because of the fragility of, say, some technical objects like mass balance or something like that, to actually dismantle it to a degree and to repack each part. So that has to be plotted and planned, mapped out, and necessary documentation carried out so that it can be put back together again in the same way as it came apart, so that there isn't a faulty relocation of the components. And that, as Andrew just said, has to be done by somebody with great expertise in handling those and making the decisions about the correct handling. Also, the packing of the objects has to be undertaken as well. That's time consuming. It's expensive in terms of the materials required, whether it's bubble wrap, not good for metals, or protector foam. That's a little bit more in line with good conservation practice. And yeah, well, that packing takes time.
Could I test a conclusion on you? If you have hundreds of thousands of objects, each of which has a risk of being damaged in the move, well, hundreds of thousands of objects, each carrying an individual risk, we can, as a sort of mathematical certainty, I would have thought, guarantee that there'll be damage to the collection from the move.
Of course.
Can you give any indication of, if you can, should that be a realistic concern, or is it just a marginal concern?
No.
How should we be rating that risk?
It's a huge risk. It does play with your mind that if you agree that an object can go out on loan, for example, of all the potential risks, that even something like, it's loaded on a truck and the truck's involved in a prang on the highway, something like that, it does affect the curatorial mind, because our whole modus operandi is the protection of those objects to make sure that they survive into the long term in its original condition as is possible.
And with the underlying knowledge that the fabric or the material of which these objects are made cannot cannot merely be replaced and the object repaired and ever achieve the condition that was evident prior to the mishap.
I'm not entirely sure the comparison is valid. I recall the transport of the items that were looted from the Parthenon to the British Museum. In the course of that transport, I think one of the ships went down, and a whole series of those, priceless artefacts were lost in that transport. It's known in history that
I don't
these
think they're going
transport
to take
things
them up the Parramatta River. I think we're okay. I don't think they're taking them.
But it's probably road transport, and each road transport carries the risk of crash and damage, doesn't it?
It does.
Yes, indeed.
And don't give them ideas about the river.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to ask Mr. Grant, you made a comment in your opening statement that you thought that the supposed limitations on the use of the Harwood building were baseless. I just wanted to draw you out a little bit on that. Why do you think that the limitations that have been suggested in relation to that building aren't with foundation?
I'm aware that comments were made in I think it was a business case the museum put forward to government in 2014 that included the claim that there were leaks in the Harwood building that were problematic. From my own experience, if there were ever leaks in the Harwood building, and I can vaguely recall it may have arisen on one or two occasions over my many years working in that building, they were never problematic to the point of causing concern about the functional capacity of the building going on well into the future. That's one example. Another example is that I understand that government and the museum management are currently of the view that access to the basement of the Harwood building to the collection there for researchers or for the public is hampered by the nature of the store being a deep store, so-called. Ian and I have on many occasions taken individuals, and we have conducted admittedly parties of limited numbers of the public through the store in the basement, and there are no practical problems if the appropriate steps are taken to do just that and continue to do that if the store was fully utilised. And I wonder if there isn't therefore another motive to overstate problems that, as I've said in my statement, I believe are baseless about the continuing function of what is still an excellent facility in any museum terms even today.
Thank you for that. I think it's useful to spell it out a little bit. I think Mr. Simpson and Mr. Debenham both made reference to the impact of the efficiency dividend on the operation of the museum over a number of years, I suppose. I wanted to, again, just to see if you could provide us with a little bit more detail and examples of how the application of that dividend and other arbitrary financial constraints, but particularly that one, have hampered the full utilisation of the museum. And Mr. Grant, of course, if you had anything to add too, but I think...
Well, just one example that's already come up in evidence in this discussion. I think a previous witness stated that in 2010 the Powerhouse stopped collecting social history objects.
That's true.
And therefore, in terms of the state not having a plan, a state plan about how it collects, what it collects and why it collects various objects, who is collecting social history of relevance to New South Wales since 2010? I don't know. Is there any museum, for example, that is collecting crockery and tableware from the Ruby Princess as a way of being able to tell future stories about the New South Wales experience of the pandemic we're going through at the moment?
Cleaned first.
we don't know, and I think that sort of shows up. But essentially, the efficiency dividends really pair a museum back to its very basic processes. It doesn't allow the museum to actually invest time and energy into experimental museology, into new research programs. It just pairs it straight back to the very sort of basic functions.
In terms of that lost functionality, the chase that has been on for the last 2 years to find the suit that that was worn by the extraordinarily famous runner at the Sydney Olympics, Kathy Freeman.
Well, you don't remember
Kathy Freeman's
It was just falling out of my brain. It was falling out of my brain. I do remember Kathy. It was falling out of my brain.
He boycotted
But, I mean,
the Olympics. He boycotted the Olympics.
That suit was lost, and it took a large amount of expertise and hunting around to find it again. The suit she wore, I think, at the end of the at the Olympics.
No.
That's the kind of work that.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Grant and Mr. Debenham, with your combined experience of 63 years in curatorial experience, would you have concerns loaning artifacts to an overseas museum or an exhibition to an overseas museum if you discovered that it was built on a floodplain?
You would have to you would have to know a little bit more about it in how the building of the museum.
I think there might be some museums near the Thames that might fit within.
But you take that into consideration. If you had something that was very, very, very precious to Australian history,
Yeah.
you would be very you would undertake due diligence to make sure
Yes.
that in
No flooding risk.
I mean, it would be an immediate concern, and you would have to look deeper into the situation of how the museum itself managed that problem of being on a floodplain, and if it had any effect in the time of that the loan was going to be in that particular museum. You would have to see whether any of the adverts, like the environmental effects, was going to have on the object that you were thinking about putting out on loan. So there'd be a lot of research goes into it before you ultimately made the decision to lend it.
Now, what do you make of there's been correspondence between Goulburn Mallory Council and the Powerhouse Museum about relocating the steam engine back to Goulburn?
No,
Yes.
It's
Yes.
yeah.
Mr. Grant, do you know anything about that?
I mentioned in my introductory statement about the 1837 Maudsley beam engine, which is under consideration for loan to Goulburn Mallory Council. I understand its intended location is the Goulburn Waterworks site, which is a very historic site. Logically, because the engine that is part of the engine house and assembly of historic structures at that site is on a riverbank site. That in itself poses the possibility of river flooding, which is a very, to your point, Mr. Secord, it's a very relevant consideration prior to whatever decision the museum reaches about whether to lend the Maudsley beam engine to that site. The possible flooding of the river is a case in point in terms of a loan object of great value and utterly irreplaceable, such as the Maudsley engine is.
But do you actually believe that the government is actually being genuine with this engagement with Goulburn? Is this, in fact, a realistic proposal, or is the government simply stringing on the council?
If we're to take the director at her word, the CEO at her word, she's indicated that the museum has yet to reach a decision about whether to agree to the loan request or not. Given that we've recently been surprised since the 4th of July, particularly by the direction that things have taken on other issues, I've not dismissed the possibility that the loan may be agreed to. Yeah.
Could I ask you about the risk profile when you're moving objects? What's the risk profile for moving a steam engine built in the first third of the 19th century. What are we talking about in terms of the risk profile to the object?
It's an extremely delicate exercise to move an artefact such as the Maudsley beam engine. Ian is best placed, probably better than anyone else in a sense, to comment about the assembly of the engine and its component parts, because he was a research assistant on its reconstruction 40 years ago, and I'm sure his memory hasn't failed him on that. As far as the choice of how one might go about it, one of the first steps that has to be taken is to, and I don't even want to talk about this in a sense because it is so inadvisable for a range of reasons that I'm hesitant to describe how you would go about something that I would strongly advise against doing. It's a bit like telling a child not to play with matches. If the child insists, do you try and minimise the damage? As far as the Maudsley is concerned, perhaps I'll allow Ian
On
to...
the child is no,
Yes.
just for the record.
Hear the
But
answer.
what's the answer on the engine?
I want to hear the answer on the engine.
On the steam,
So would
on the-
Goulburn.
Well,
Yeah.
Well, I would, purely on the basis that the engine is an exhibit in a permanent exhibition, as I've indicated in my introductory statement, any such loan request would be declined without consideration. If consideration was seriously given to it, the risk profile would be would reach peaks in terms of its handling from its current site in the museum to its location on road transport, presumably a low loader of some kind, whether or not it was disassembled, and which I'll allow Ian to comment on, and it would have to be at least partially disassembled, which carries its own risks, and how it would be packed and handled, how the cast components would be protected from vibratory damage, whether you would carry out, and you probably would carry out, scans of the components to ensure that you knew whether there were unseen cracks in any of the components before you moved the engine as a conservation measure. Am I helping here?
Yeah.
You would go through a process of photography of all the parts. You would do a condition assessment of the parts, not just the engine as a whole. You would interrogate the in most great detail the conditions in which the engine was to be displayed. They themselves could nullify any chance of such a loan being approved because the engine is currently in climate-controlled conditions, which would have to be at least matched where it was going. Its physical risk, the risk of security, would have to be assessed so as to ensure that it was not damaged in any way by in being vandalised or mishandled. Perhaps I'll allow Ian to continue with anything I've missed.
One last thing. So would you go as far as to describe it as it would be virtually a military exercise to move it?
Yes.
From
Yes.
Yeah. Would you agree with that, Mr. Debenham?
It would be. I mean, I would just have stopped the whole thing because it's almost 200 years old. It's cast iron. It's extremely fragile. So to take it, you would have to have a special truck with sort of air suspension to be able to take the bumps out of the road, because there is a risk of shattering the components. Yeah, you take the beam out of it because that's a big heavy weight up high. There'd probably be some smaller components you'd take out, but no, and there's always the risk of disturbing some of the components, because these engines were shipped as a sort of a kit of parts, and they were put together by engineers on site. So there's the level of getting all the different components to relate to one another properly, like the cylinder has to be a certain distance away from the beam so that the piston doesn't endeavour to go down through the bottom of the cylinder, for example, and that then sits on the sort of vacuum chamber that's created to give the necessary suction on the thing. That's also made out of cast iron, so if that is in any way damaged or removed from its position, then it has to be relocated, realigned. There's a heck of a lot of work to do, and quite frankly, I just would have said at an inquiry like this that no, it's too valuable an object because its historic relationship. Henry Maudsley was the father, if you will, of mass production, of engineering in an engineering sense. One of his apprentices was Joseph Whitworth, who created the Whitworth thread system. So it's internationally famous, and to put it at any risk at all is just not conscionable. As I say, curators tend to get rather worried about things like this.
It's been put to me by members of the Goulburn community that the government is just stringing on the community down there.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
Grant, could I ask you a question?
I think there's really good reason to not do it.
Sure.
Is it on this same point?
Thanks. No, it's not.
Well, could I just ask for a conclusion on it?
No, you can't, because the government hasn't had any time for questions at all, and we have 4 minutes left. I respectfully submit
Yeah,
to
please.
that. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Grant, can I just go to your opening statement
Yes,
where
Mr.
you
Franklin.
talked about the 3 major items that were...
Yes.
It was confirmed that they'd be kept at the Ultimo site.
Yes.
And you'd said, I'm paraphrasing you here, that the implication that these items will be retained means potentially that nothing else will. I guess I just want to push gently back on that assertion and say, now I've had a look at the letter that the Premier sent as well, and it says, for example, the establishment of 2 world-class facilities will provide more opportunities for the public to engage with the Powerhouse Museum's extraordinary collection. To me, the implication there is that the collection will be displayed in both museums. And I guess I would just ask if I've misunderstood that, or if you were actually suggesting that the Ultimo site would only house those 3 items.
I regard that, in response to your comment, Mr. Franklin, I regard that third paragraph from which you've just quoted in the Premier's letter as being very open to interpretation. And the reason I say that is that much effort is being put into emphasising the future role of the Castle Hill site in terms of access to the collection. It is a very valid point, particularly in the virtual and digital age in which we live, in which our children are being educated, that museums as a generalisation have much to offer in terms of providing the opportunity for the public to engage with real objects, and that it's quite reasonable to assert that the Castle Hill site in its full development, and that's yet to be, of course, but when it's more fully developed, it will offer wonderful opportunities to expose the public to the collection in a display storage mode. Now, the 2 world-class facilities which are mentioned in that paragraph by the Premier are obviously Ultimo and Parramatta, but my interpretation of that is that it's a generalisation, that they will provide more opportunities for the public to engage, etc., in the Powerhouse Museum's extraordinary collection. To me, could be interpreted in a variety of ways, not necessarily that means that the exhibitions that we've been discussing this morning, that are currently part of the fabric of the museum, I would maintain, will need to be maintained in order for that statement to be valid.
Sure. So your position is clearly and apparently that you would like the Ultimo site to continue to be an operational museum with more than just those 3 large items, obviously a significant amount of the collection being on display.
Absolutely, and properly funded and redeveloped so that it can continue to offer new perspectives on the vast array of themes that have been explored since 1988 and which should continue to be explored, and inspire people, particularly young people, about the directions that some of the newer technologies that we're looking at today may take them in terms of their careers, particularly in science, technology, engineering and mathematics.
Thanks, Mr. Grant.
Mr. Grant, do you see the construction of a lyric theatre there compatible with what you've just said?
Not at all. I have no objection to the construction of a lyric theatre, but certainly not on that site. I don't see it as complementing in any way what is already serving a very current and future need on the site in the Harwood building.
You spoke at some length about the risks of moving that 1837 steam engine.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be unfair to characterise that proposal to move the steam engine as just plain reckless?
From a curatorial point of view, yes, I think it's reckless and wasteful.
Reckless and wasteful.
Mr. Debenham?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
Reckless and wasteful.
I think we've come to an end of our questioning.
Unless,
Thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Committee.